It all begins when Javier plays one of his classic commercials from 1998, depicting the perfect family life for a job interview. The young recruiters are impressed with the work and how innovative it was for the time, but some elements are outdated. They request to see something more recent from his portfolio, but are underwhelmed with what he presents. It was from his last job, which he left about a year ago. The interviewers conclude that he hasn't had work since that period, so he mustn't be really that sought after. They start by raving about his status in the advertisement industry and try to politely disqualify him as a prospect by saying that the vacancy is beneath someone of his level. The former executive is desperate for the job, so he brushes their compliments off, stating that he is willing to take the position. They are left with no other option but to tell him straight that his ideas are outdated and don't suit the agency's direction. He shows himself out, and as he passes through the office, the contrast between him and the workplace is obvious. He drives his very nice BMW to his home located at the upscale part of town. Upon arrival, you know this guy was making good money just from the view. Later that night, he has dinner with his wife Marga as their son plays his game console. She asks him about his recent job interview, but he tries to put on a strong front saying that it went well, but you know how ladies can smell the bull. She suggests that they downsize to a property that they own in a less prestigious part of town, but he is reluctant to do so. She explains that paying the rent of their current residence is killing them financially since Javier lost his job. The fancy BMW might have to go too, since they have a Fiat they can manage for now. The man tries to change the subject by seducing his wife, which totally works. A few days later, Javier decides to listen to his wife's advice to downsize. One morning, he tries to assure his son that everything will be back to normal in no time. He will not have to change from his private school since they paid in advance. The kid would rather just switch to a public school now instead of delaying the inevitable. Javier is confused by that statement. His son reveals that everyone at school knows about their financial turmoil and make fun of him about it. It starts to rain later on in the day, so he offers to drop off their maid at the metro. Before she gets out of the car, he alerts her that they are moving, so they will have to terminate her contract since times are hard for them. She pleads, but when Javier asks for her set of keys, she gets annoyed and throws it at him before exiting the car. Moving day arrives and they pack their things from their luxury apartment into their normal one. The contrast is clear, as he now has to manually pull the blinds to the view of a billboard of the city. As he continues to experience rejection interview after interview, Marga proves that she is not a gold digger and goes to find a job at a local retail store. Javier decides to enroll in some self-help class to make himself more employable. He lands another interview at an old friend's agency where he tries to impress. They offer him the job and the eager beaver says he can start right away. His friend leaves the meeting to take an important conference call. He leaves him to finalize the details with his assistant. Upon reviewing the contract, he realizes that it is basically a 6-month internship with no pay. Javier leaves the office frustrated about the big insult he just received. He snaps and kicks his own car door, but shortly regrets it as he tries to fix the dents. While doing so, he finds the spare keys that the maid bounced off his head. That evening, he makes his way to his old home and watches the new family that have moved in. The following day, he makes his way there again and waits for the young couple to leave for work before sneaking inside the building. He almost gets caught entering when the neighbor's dog starts barking, but he makes it inside in time. Javier then proceeds to eat their cereal and take a dump in the toilet before looking around the house and the pictures of Thomas, his wife Lara, and their daughter Monica. He leaves quietly and later asks his son to go for a run with him so that they can bond. But due to his obesity, he starts to vomit. When they return, Marga gets upset that he made their son vomit, which leads to an argument about her not alerting him that their son was getting bullied in school. She suggests he goes out and get some air, which he does, but he goes to his old house again. While watching, he receives a call from someone interested in buying the BMW, but he changes his mind about selling it. Day breaks and he infiltrates into the house again. This time around, he rummages through their things to find information about the family's lifestyle. Javier makes his way into Thomas's office and looks through his computer. He finds that the man has a drinking problem that caused him to get his family in a nasty car accident. He goes through Thomas's schedule and finds out that he goes to a support group at a church. He attends and infiltrates the group pretending to be someone struggling with drinking. Javier uses plot points from Thomas's own experiences to weave his backstory in order to get him to resonate, and it works. At the end of the session, Thomas comes to give him some words of encouragement. Javier uses it as an opportunity to establish a friendship with his target by asking him for a coffee. There, he continues to flesh out his story, revealing that his wife and daughter left him because of his bad habits, This frees Thomas to also open up about some of his problems. Javier makes it home after his coffee date, and his wife worriedly asks of his whereabouts. He makes up a lie about his class running late. Day breaks, and this guy has made going to his ex-house a job because he's there again. This time he drops some minced meat on the floor before entering the building. After almost getting caught in the elevator, he makes his way inside the apartment where he messes with Thomas's schedule by moving Monica's gymnastics class to 1 hour later before syncing it across all his devices. He then looks outside where the noisy neighbor's dog lays dead. The minced meat was poisoned to get rid of any unpredictable variables. Javier later makes his way to a bar opposite Monica's gymnastic practice, where he witnesses Lara berating Thomas for not coming at the right time to pick their daughter. He tries to explain, but she doesn't listen as she drives off. In a moment of weakness, Thomas makes his way into the bar, tempted to buy a drink, but he restrains himself. Javier hides in a toilet, thinking that his target came in because he saw him. At the support group meeting, Thomas talks again for the first time in 6 months and addresses how close he was to relapsing after the fight with his wife. Javier decides to follow up by thanking everyone for the support so far. When the meeting ends, the new friends go out for coffee again, where Javier preys further into Thomas's fight with his wife while planting his own seeds into his head. After the chat, he invites Javier for dinner the next day. The following evening, Javier makes his way to his old home officially this time. He rings Thomas's apartment intercom with flowers in hand. He answers and alerts him that he's coming. While waiting, the groundsman named Damien recognizes him and starts having small talk with him. He lies to the groundsman about the purpose of his visit, stating that he's there to pick up old letters and that the flowers are for his wife. Damien finds it a bit odd but plays along. Javier nervously watches as the elevator comes down, hoping that their conversation ends before Thomas shows up, and it does to his relief. Thomas welcomes him into the apartment and gives the old owner a tour of the place before they are interrupted by Lara. The two exchange pleasantries, and the mother also introduces Monica, who he greets too. The adults have dinner together where they discuss various topics. After the food, Javier compliments Lara on supporting her husband during his recovery as he helps her load the dishes into the washer. She asks him about his family, and he brings out his fake story about a divorce, which makes her feel guilty for asking. The following morning, Damien gives Monica a flower before asking Thomas about his interaction with his apartment's old tenant. Thomas explains that he is not aware about what he's talking about before leaving. Meanwhile, in an empty underground parking lot, Javier executes the next part of his plan by deliberately crashing his car. He calls Thomas pretending to be drunk. He rushes over to see him sitting in the passenger seat with alcohol in his hand. He wrestles the bottle from Javier's hand, spilling some on himself in the process. Javier explains that seeing his happy family and success the previous night made him miss his own family, and as a result, he began to drink. Thomas uses his deadly allergy of peanuts as an analogy to explain how they should look at alcohol. He explains his job is given to him by his father-in-law who owns the company, so he doesn't really have freedom. Javier pretends that his phone is dead, which is why he hasn't called a tow truck. So Thomas gives him his phone to call one while he goes out to clean himself. Javier uses this as an opportunity to send an email to himself before calling the towing company. He asks Thomas to not inform Lara about what happened. When Javier returns home, he lies to his wife that he has sold the car and the money should reflect in the coming days. He excuses himself when he receives a call from Damien. The groundsman alerts him that he knows and wants to meet to discuss something with him. In the interim, Lara smells the alcohol on her husband's shirt and fears that he has relapsed, so she confronts him about it. He comes clean about the situation with Javier, which calms the tension. The following day, the washed-up executive meets Damien at a zoo where he blackmails him to retrieve something very disgusting from Thomas's house. He makes his way to the house and picks what he has been told to retrieve. Lara comes back home unexpectedly as she forgot her phone. Unlucky for Javier, she calls his phone as she wants to meet with him. She hears a phone buzzing, so she gets freaked out and starts looking around, but he silences it and hides so he doesn't get caught. He later responds to her voicemail and meets up with her at a coffee shop, where she tries to politely warn him to cut his friendship with her husband. Lara informs him that she knows about his incident and that he asked Thomas to lie to her. Javier twists everything on Thomas, stating that her husband has relapsed and is lying. It was rather him that was drunk. He shows her the email that he sent from Thomas's phone, which makes it look like her husband is drinking again. Javier later watches his handiwork as the young couple argue in their balcony. Thomas calls him, but he ignores it. Later on, he receives a package with 2 cans of pepper spray. He injects one with a substance before throwing the evidence away, but Marga notices. He sets off to meet Damien, but takes a detour to his night class when he notices that his wife is tailing him. He stays there long enough for her to leave to his relief. The following morning, he meets up with the weird groundsman. He hands over the package and tries to leave, but Damien asks him to put a camera in the house. He's reluctant but takes it. Javier gets fed up with the groundsman's sick preferences, so he sabotages his leaf blower. When he uses it, the machine ignites, burning him severely. During that time, Javier makes his way to Thomas's office and shows his true nature by revealing that he did lie about everything which causes Thomas to attack him. He takes his battered face to Lara's apartment. Around this time, Damien is getting rushed to the hospital for his burns. He uses the attack on him to further solidify the narrative that Thomas is an unhinged drunk. As Lara tends to his wounds, he plants the seed that her husband thinks that they are having an affair. After finding out that Thomas has moved out temporarily, he gives her the chemically injected pepper spray to protect herself just in case her violent husband comes. She's reluctant at first, but accepts it. Javier quietly walks into his house and starts packing his things before leaving his family with his wife, speechless. He checks into a hotel where he calls Lara to alert her that he can get Monica some one-on-one time with her favorite gymnast. She agrees, so they go and have a good time watching her hero perform. He gets a group picture and sends it to Thomas, which makes him livid. The roles have reversed, as it is now Thomas that watches from a distance, while Javier is close to the family, as he hands a sleepy Monica over to her mother before leaving. Soon after, a drunken Thomas barges into the apartment as Lara pleads for him to get out. She put Monica in her room before confronting her husband. He tries to explain that Javier is manipulating them, but the way he has presented himself, she doesn't believe him. He grabs her aggressively to try and get his point across, so she uses the pepper spray on him. She quickly realizes something is wrong when he starts to choke. He falls to the floor and stops breathing for some time. She frantically calls Javier for help, who was outside the whole time. He makes his way up to comfort Lara before calmly asking her to go inside the room with her daughter. He calls the police while he switches the pepper spray to a normal one. Thomas regains consciousness to Javier's surprise, but he whispers to him before smothering him to death. The killer goes into the room to hug the family of the man he just killed. Later, Javier drops Monica off at school in a new BMW before heading to work at the place that gave him that shocking offer. But from his interaction with his friend, he now has a senior role at the agency. They discuss an upcoming sales pitch to his father-in-law, but they are interrupted by a call that Marga wants to see him. He somehow managed to marry Lara. Javier goes to meet her, where his ex-wife reveals that she has been studying the case and knows that he killed Thomas by injecting peanut extract into the pepper spray. She threatens to go to the police, but he counters by saying he will remove all of their son's benefit and will put them on the street since he owns the house that they stay in. He leaves her speechless for the second time. After a successful meeting, he makes his way to his beauty house, embraces his new wife, and eats dinner with his stolen family. Javier stands at the backyard window as the blinds reveal his perfectly manicured landscaped garden. The whole sequence mimics his classic advertisement that made him so famous. That brings the movie to an end. The next story is called Velvet Buzzsaw. Renowned art critic Morph shows his importance as he jumps the long queue for the Art Basel show. He makes his way into the exhibition floor where he comes across an android art piece called Hobo Man. After inspecting it, he has a pretentious conversation with the agent of the artist as he gives his hash opinion. Meanwhile, outside the exhibition, Josephine takes her daily Instapic with a large order of coffee in hand. She is interrupted by a call from her coworker named Coco, who alerts her that her boyfriend is having an affair with another woman. Back inside, Gretchen tries to soften Morph up to hear his opinion on a piece she wants to buy for the museum she works for. He hints that it could be a good buy when his attention is taken as Josephine walks past them. The art critic quickly rushes over and notices that she's upset and hands her a handkerchief to wipe away her tears as she vaguely explains the situation. She arrives at her desk where Bryson, the art installer, makes fun of her for being late with the coffee. He wanders off to alert their boss Rodora of Morph's presence at the exhibition. She quickly makes her way to him where they discuss an interactive art piece called The Sphere. He is more interested in the rumors that her agency might be losing their best artist peers to her rival John, but she dodges the question before leaving. After the exhibition, the important people head over to the after party, where Josephine sits there depressed while Morph tries to comfort her. Meanwhile, the two top dogs in the art curation scene are making their moves as Rodora is there to recruit an upcoming artist named Damrish, while John completes his poach of peers. Josephine decides to ditch the party to attend a satellite show, and Morph tags along, after which they make their way to her place where the critic insults the show and reminisce about a moment they had between themselves in the past. The following morning, Rodora sends a voice message complaining about the lack of sales they made from the exhibition, with the sphere being the only exception. In the interim, Morph is at his place looking at pictures of him and Josephine. All the while, she leaves her apartment and finds a walking stick at the entrance. She looks around and sees a human hand protruding from the top floor. Josephine makes her way up to find an old man collapsed on the floor. She alerts a fellow tenant to call the paramedics, while a cat meows from the room. Rodora comes into the office to find no one at the reception desk. As the phone rings, she asks Bryson who's supposed to be there. The snitch informs her it's supposed to be Josephine, and even adds more spice to his sabotage by stating that she's always late. The boss asks Coco to take her place at the desk, prompting her to answer the call. Bryson tries to make his impression on her by stating that he too is an artist, but she's really not that interested. Rodora has a catch-up with Morph about the new artists that she's signing, and he's impressed with the roster she's building. Soon after the call, Josephine comes late and apologizes to her boss. She tells about the sudden death at her apartment building, but Rodora has already taken Bryson's word and decides to demote her till she gets her act together. She explains that Installer holds a grudge against her because she turned him down when he tried to make a move on her. After work, she goes home to drink her bad luck away, but later makes her way down to collect her mail. She has small talk with a tenant who alerts her that the old man was an artist and left a note that all his work should be thrown away. She smells an opportunity, so she makes her way to the old man's room and begins to inspect the eerily captivating art, but gets startled when the cat pops out from a lampshade. The following day, Josephine meets up with Morph, who professes his love for her. She also returns the feelings, which kind of makes them a couple, but she is more interested in him having a look at the artwork. The critic is absolutely awe-inspired by the works. He alerts her that there will be a big market for it, which is music to her ears. She reveals herself to be the one who represents the artist. Later at the office, Coco is harshly scolded for allowing a hostile competitor into the workplace. Josephine remembers that she wanted a cat, so she gives her the old man's one. When she returns to her desk, she meets Bryson looking at the artwork, and he too is moved by it, but she sacks him away. Later that evening, Josephine looks through the artwork, which she has now moved to her room. She's interrupted by an unexpected knock on the door and nervously opens it to find Rodora standing there, who proceeds to let herself in. Bryson snitched again, so the boss has come to look at her little find. She identifies the artist as Vetril Dees from what is written on the painting. Josephine explains how she came to possess them. Her boss strong-arms her into partnering together because of a non-compete clause in her contract. They later get lawyers to help get her story straight, that she found them in a dumpster. They move some of the collection to the office, where Morph offers his services for exclusive rights to write a book on the artist and his works. He also takes some pieces for himself. Meanwhile, at the painting forensic lab, Gita calls Rodora to alert her of her disturbing findings. As she steps away, blood oozes from a part of the painting. Back at the office, Coco overhears a conversation of her boss with a PI about covering Vetril Dees' dark past. Morph also begins doing his research on the artist for the book, and finds out that he had a rough life because he was abused by his father as a child. He used his art to express these traumas. While he writes his books, Josephine interrupts to alert him that her ex-boyfriend is having an exhibition, so he should review Bomb-It for her. Rodora later holds an exhibition showcasing Dees' work, where some critics reveal to Morph that his review of the ex-boyfriend's exhibition crushed him. It caused him to crash his car while in a drunken state and is currently in a coma, which makes Morph feel guilty. Meanwhile, Josephine gets confused when Rodora spreads the narrative that the number of pieces produced by Dees was very limited. She explains that artificially increasing the value of the works through scarcity is a tactic of the trade. The boss has asked Bryson to take some of the artwork to a shortage facility in the mountains for a rainy day. He stops on the way and removes a few pieces for himself before continuing. While driving, he lights a cigarette to smoke while glancing at the art he just stole. When he looks away, the painting moves, triggering the supernatural activities. The ash from his cigarette ignites his shirt, causing him severe burns. He manages to extinguish the fire while driving, but gets spooked out when he sees an apparition of the artist in his mirror. This causes him to crash into an abandoned car garage. He extinguishes another fire that threatens to burn the expensive art. Bryson yells for help but gets no response, so he breaks into the building to soothe the burns on his skin. As he does so, the painting of monkeys hung on the wall come to life and drags him inside as he tries to fight back. The following day, Josephine and Rodora have tracked Bryson's van to the police impound yard. The officer explains events based on the evidence at the scene. According to their reports, he might have hit his head after the accident and wandered into the woods. There is also a homeless camp nearby, so anything of value in the car was probably cleared out by them. But Rodora tries to cover their tracks by reporting that nothing of value was in the car. Josephine berates her ex-boss for this blunder before speeding off. Rodora calls Bryson thinking that he has run off with the paintings. Meanwhile, John pays Piers a visit for them to discuss his next project. He mistakes a pile of trash for artwork and starts to prize it till he's alerted that it's not art. Very awkward indeed. Later on, Morph alerts Josephine that while cataloging Deese's work for the book, he noticed that there are large gaps from periods of his work. She knows this could be caused by the missing painting, but says nothing. Back at John's office, Coco comes in for a job interview after being sacked for her earlier mistake. He notices that she worked for Rodora. Coco plays to that by giving him information about a scandalous file about Deese. This gets her the job. Elsewhere, Gretchen tries to get the museum to have an exhibition starring Deese, which they are very much interested in. Morph's research leads him to one of the few people that knew Deese. He finds out that a private investigator is also on the trail. That PI was hired by John, and he's found information on Deese that could expose his dark past and devalue his work. After their meeting, John prepares to close the office alone when the supernatural starts happening again, as he too owns one of Deese's painting. He gets hung by a sinister hand when he tries to change a malfunctioning light bulb over an art installation. The following day, Coco comes in with coffee, only to find her new boss's lifeless body hanging from the ceiling. Soon after his funeral is held, Morph, with his critical eye, bashes the color of his casket. Damrish sits next to Josephine, and she immediately starts flirting with him in front of her boyfriend, who doesn't notice. The art agent for Hoboman complains to the critic that his unfavorable review for artwork killed the sale. It is now gathering dust at storage facility. Later, Morph starts to see the paintings move while doing some adult exercise with Josephine, which spooks him out. They break into an argument when he tells her that he's seeing things, but after exchanging some words, they hug it out. Afterward, the critic makes his way to an eye doctor for an examination. To his surprise, his vision has rather made an improvement. He calls Gretchen after the appointment to criticize her for telling Josephine that he is still with his ex when that was not the case. As he starts shouting down the phone, Gretchen alerts him that she has a live visual on Josephine out on a date with Damrish. He cuts the call and makes his way to Gita's lab, where she informs him that Deese used his own blood to paint some of the reddish blacks and the shadows in all of his works. Meanwhile, at the art museum, it is revealed that Coco now works for Gretchen when she is dismissed after a long day of work. Gretchen stays back alone and decides to interact with the sphere by putting her arm in one of the holes. Her facial expression turns from delight to horror as she is unable to remove her hand. It is only released after her arm is ripped to shreds. She falls to the floor, bleeding out. The following morning, Josephine alerts Rodora of her death, but the Deese exhibition is doing fantastically well, so they don't know whether to jump for joy or cry. Their call is interrupted when Morph comes over. After also hearing the bad news, he walks in to see Damrish making breakfast, and just like that, Morph and Josephine's romance is dead. As he packs some of his belonging out, he sees Gretchen with her arm off on the side of a bus, but it changes to a normal hand shortly after. The critic continues to see and hear things. It gets so bad that he confronts Rodora about it. He warns her that all the strange things happening is connected to the art. It must be imbued with some kind of dark spirit. He suggests that they do what the artist instructed and throw it all away, but the money is too much for her to do that. He promises to write an article about darkness of Deese's work. The critic intends to box up the pieces he has. He posts the article and quickly calls Coco to hire her as a temporary assistant to help him archive and pack all the art. He then receives a call from Josephine, who scolds him for the article before going to a risky-looking bar with Damrish. While there, the artist reveals that he's gone back to his old agent. An annoyed Josephine leaves the bar, but her car is blocked, so she calls a tow company to move it. As she waits, an art museum suddenly pops up behind her, so she enters and calls Rodora to inform her about Damrish's departure. While they discuss, the paint from the art behind her starts to flow towards her. Meanwhile, Morph goes to his art storage unit where he's confronted and killed by Hoboman. Rodora also has a close encounter with death when one of her garden art pieces almost crushes her. While she was outside, Josephine gets attacked by the paint as it completely covers her while she screams. The following day, Coco makes it 3 for 3 as she finds Morph's dead body. Josephine's car rather gets towed. She can be seen in the graffiti in the wall with a facial expression of anguish. Rodora seems to have survived as she receives a call informing of the famous critic's death. She has a moving company pack, all the art in her house out. She sits in her backyard thinking she's made it alive, but suddenly, her tattoo of a buzzsaw on her neck starts to spin like a real one, also killing her. Coco has had enough of the deaths, so she decides to pack back to her hometown with the cat. She passes a homeless man who's ironically selling the missing pieces from Deeze's work to a couple for $5. That brings the movie to an end. The final movie is called The Man Who Knew Infinity. It all begins with Ramanujan, who works on some equation on the floor of the local temple before he goes job hunting in the rain. He presents his impressive book of mathematical formulas to his potential employer, but he's turned down harshly because he doesn't have a degree. Ramanujan makes his way to his shared accommodation deflated and frustrated. He complains to his friend about having a wife that he can't provide for, as well as the fact that he might die poor, but later laughs it off. The following morning, he visits Narayana for employment. He's impressed, even assuming he has multiple degrees based on the level of his work. Narayana offers him a job as a clerk, but under the condition that he helps him understand his work in the evenings. He presents Ramanujan to their boss, Sir Francis, but he's not impressed with his level of refinement, so dismisses him. Ramanujan pleads his case. With a stable job secured, he sends for his mother and his wife, with whom he's not fully acquainted. He leaves them to inspect their new home as he goes back to work. He's briefly interrupted by Narayana when he notices him doing the balancing without the use of an abacus. Ramanujan explains that he's faster at doing it in his head to his surprise, but Narayana also warns him against using the paper to work on his equation, reminding him that it's an expensive commodity. He suggests Ramanujan use the packing down at the docks. Later that night, the two meet up to go over Ramanujan's theoretical mathematics. Narayana suggests they seek an audience with someone who can understand and appreciate his work. His new clerk reveals that he's been to everyone in the city of Madras. Narayana scoffs, but they are interrupted when Ramanujan's wife Janaki scolds him for not coming home early. She gets worried that he loves his numbers more than her, but he assures her that's not the case. As they make their way home, he tries to explain what maths means to him, which moves her a little. The following morning, he enlightens his mother that his boss might be looking for people overseas who can understand his work. Janaki is excited at the news, but it's quelled by his mother, who's horrified. She warns him they are Brahmins, so it's forbidden for them to cross the seas. With his mum's words ringing in his ears, he's reluctant to listen to his friend's advice, but later decides to write a letter accompanied by a sample of his work. With endorsement from Sir Francis, the letters reach Professor Hardy at Trinity College, Cambridge University. Upon reading it, he concludes that it's a hoax from one of his colleagues called Littlewood and confronts him about it during their game of tennis. But he denies knowing anything about it. With his continued refusal, the professor later revisits the letter with a new lens. Meanwhile, the rest of the other fellows sit after dinner discussing the likelihood of war breaking out. Hardy briefly excuses Littlewood to have a look at Ramanujan's work. It contains integrals and infinite series that they find hard to decipher. After the two professors discuss, Hardy decides to invite Ramanujan to Cambridge, England to work with them. He takes Janaki to the beachside to break the news to her, but she's worried about the social isolation their family might face. But Ramanujan promises to send for her as soon as he's able. Under that condition, she happily gives her blessing for him to make the journey. Later that night, he requests that she cut his hair to signify this conviction. The next morning, his mother is mortified to see his hair cut and to hear that he's going to England. She tries to accuse Janaki of wanting to run away with her son, but she later accepts the reality of the situation as they all escort him to the port for an emotional send-off. After the long voyage, he arrives at Cambridge and is awe-stricken by the beauty of the architecture. Littlewood meets and escorts him to see Hardy. As they proceed, he shows him the tree Newton sat under, which inspired him to formulate the theory of universal gravity. Meanwhile, the other professors express their disgrace that someone with no higher educational background could make it to their prestigious institution. Hardy tries to explain that Ramanujan is a special case, but they point out his work have no proofs. Although impressive, it lacks impact as they can't just take his work at face value, but Hardy puts his pride on the line by bringing him in. He advises his colleagues to embrace change. The room falls silent when Ramanujan enters it. He's excited to meet Hardy, but he's a bit disheartened by the professor's reserved reception. He's later shown to his room where he makes himself comfortable. He makes his way to dinner where he's welcomed by an Indian named Chandra and his English friend Andrew. After the pleasant introduction, Ramanujan is compelled to leave early when he's served meat and vegetables cooked in animal fat as he's a vegetarian. The following day, he's placed in a class taught by Professor Howard, who gets angry when he sees him not making notes, so he tries to humiliate Ramanujan in front of the class by asking him to solve a formula. He takes the chalk and solves it with ease to his teacher's surprise, as he himself hadn't completed the proof yet. Talk about the most intellectual mic drop. At the end of the lesson, he gets salty and asks Ramanujan to stay back, where he berates him for getting the right answer, even getting a bit physical with him. Being a bit disoriented by what just happened, he stumbles into a room full of statues and stained glass windows of the great intellectuals throughout history. He later meets up with his mentor Hardy, who has already heard about his incident with Mr. Howard, but he's more interested in how he knew the theorem. He answers, saying it just came to him. Ramanujan feels like they are wasting time doing proofs when he has the formulas, but Hardy explains that intuition is not enough because the formulas have to be held accountable. He compares him to some of the great mathematicians like Jacobi and Euler. With his exceptional gift for numbers and their aim of opposing the areas of mathematics that are so well researched, they can't afford to be wrong, hence the need for proofs. Hardy then takes him to the university library, which houses invaluable literature. He reveals his goal to leave a legacy in such places. Just as Newton's memorialized works represent the physical aspects of mathematics, he believes that Ramanujan's notebooks represent the abstract. It took Newton a long time to be proved, so they have an obligation to prove Ramanujan's notes. If they can do so, his books too will be memorialized. With the goal now understood, Ramanujan makes his way to the post office, where he receives a letter and red ribbon from his wife. She writes of how everyone is proud of him, how much she misses him, and awaits a letter asking her to come over to be with him. With a boost of confidence, Ramanujan discovers a new series and excitedly rushes to show Hardy, but he no-scopes him down from cloud 9. He's not interested with a new series, but rather needs proofs. But Ramanujan begs him to have a look at it, and reminds him of his promise to help him publish his work before storming off. Soon after, Hardy takes a look, and its partitions are so accessible that the professor explains it to his butler. With the wind taken out of his sails, Ramanujan tries to work the university way but doesn't find much success. Hardy gives him a glimpse of what they can achieve if they take the proper steps by presenting his first published work, as the professor managed to prove some of Ramanujan's work. The news of his achievement has reached India, so his mother and wife throw a small party to celebrate. Narayana asks Janaki how Ramanujan is doing, but his mother tells him to disregard her after claiming that she's not a supportive wife. Janaki excuses herself from the situation, upset. Meanwhile, back in England, the news has spread that the country is at war. Chandra and Andrew wake Ramanujan, informing of the announcement and arrival of the king. He worries how Janaki will make it to England now. Andrew assures him the war will be over soon. The professors also watch on when Littlewood informs Hardy that he received a letter from the War Office requesting his assistance with ballistics. Elsewhere, Janaki dictates a response to his worries about the war. She informs him that it is far from India, and she has hopes to come after things settle. The scribe sees that she misses her husband. He was an acquaintance of Ramanujan, so informs her she can get close to him if she goes to the alcove, as he spent the majority of his time there. She goes and finds his formulas written on the floor, which eases her pain a little. Back at home, her mother-in-law is hostile against her, but Janaki still tries to show respect. She pleads for her to post her letter to Ramanujan to inform him she will come, but his mother hides the letter instead. With the war in full swing, parts of the university is used as temporal hospitals to treat wounded soldiers. Ramanujan makes his way to buy some vegetables, but because of the war, the food is scarce, so he buys what he can. He then makes his way to the post office expecting his wife's letter and is surprised that it has not arrived. As he walks to his room, he's attacked by some bigoted soldiers. One night, Hardy receives a letter from Littlewood outlining a possible mistake with one of Ramanujan's theorems on primes. But his main point of the letter is to advise Hardy to nurture the outstanding talent that is Ramanujan, and not to restrict him too much. He must see that all of his work amounts to something in order to prove their doubters wrong. The following morning, Hardy reads Littlewood's letter to him, but Ramanujan is adamant that he's right, which leads to a heated argument between the two. The bruised-up genius storms off again after revealing the sacrifice he's made to be there. But after some thought, Ramanujan concedes and starts working to Hardy's template, passing him some work through his room door. The professor later meets him at the hospital looking sick, but Ramanujan downplays it severely. With his spirit broken, he works through the equations. Hardy sees an opportunity and asks Professor Major and Master Partitions to help them work, as they are on the verge of a major breakthrough. Though he's an opponent of the young genius, he decides to help push him after meeting with Ramanujan and being impressed with his mind. Ramanujan and Hardy work together to crack it before Major, but in the background his health is starting to fail. He goes to the clinic with Chandra where he's diagnosed with tuberculosis. He warns his friend not to let Hardy know. With Ramanujan's relentless level of work, Hardy puts him forward for a fellowship at the university, but they reject him because he's Indian. He later goes for another checkup where he's told he doesn't have long to live. It all becomes too much, so he visits the train station to end it all, but he's saved by the conductor. He's rushed back to the hospital where his condition is finally brought to Hardy's attention. While he recovers, he thinks about his wife while holding the red string she gave him. All this time, he still hasn't received word from her, but he's oblivious that this is his mother's doing, as he feels like Janaki has forsaken him. Back in India, she too feels the same about him. Hardy visits him one day, and Ramanujan finally discloses that it's his God that reveals the formulas to him. He is well aware that the professor is an atheist, but implores him to believe him for the sake of their friendship. But he just can't do that. However, he does believe in Ramanujan, which seems to reassure him. He informs Hardy that they should finish the work they started. So the professor pulls out some equations from his portable stash. Ramanujan expresses his wish to go back when he finishes. Hardy gives him a letter from his wife, which informs him that she's leaving him because he's abandoned her. Later that night, he pens a letter while also working on the final parts of the partition. The following morning, he gives the professor the answer, and they are within Par 04, which is exceptional. He also gives him a letter to post to his wife. Hardy sends the answer plus the proofs to Major, who confirms it to be right. With such an achievement, Hardy puts in an application for Royal Fellowship for Ramanujan. He presents his work in front of the committee, who are compelled to acknowledge his intelligence, accepting his application. While on his sickbed, he receives the fantastic news to his disbelief. Ramanujan's letter also reaches Janaki, and the scribe reads it to her. She immediately makes her way to her mother-in-law's room and finds all the letters she hid. She tries to justify her actions while Janaki cries. Later on, a much healthier Ramanujan also gets officially accepted as a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He makes his way back to India to see his wife and family with the intention to come back after a year. Upon his arrival, he reconciles with his wife, but 1 year later, Hardy receives a letter informing him of Ramanujan's death after losing his battle to tuberculosis. A special ceremony is held for him at the Cambridge University, where his great achievements were proclaimed for all to hear. At the university library, his books have been memorialized. That brings the movie to an end.